I'm Kate Niederhoffer, and I did my PhD at University of Texas in Jamie Pennebaker's lab, where Ryan is currently a grad student, set to complete fall of this year. And I came at this honestly, but I guess ended up academically. And what I mean to say there, I'm not really sure. I think there's like a joke in there somewhere. But the idea is that I was building an app for advice, trying to help people get advice on complicated personal or professional situations for which there isn't a right answer. And based on my research in grad school, I'm just accustomed to looking at the world based on the way people talk and what we can tell about people based on the words they use. And so as I was building this and kind of got more into the world of product market fit, and was trying to better understand what type of people want advice, why do they want advice, who wants advice, who likes to give advice, who likes to get advice, and some of those kind of interesting intricacies. I found myself at a conference with Ryan, and Ryan has really taken the world of Jamie's lab from just understanding what we can tell about people based on their words into big data and really getting people out of the lab and looking at language in the real world with massive data sets. And so as I was talking to Ryan about, I'm really interested in advice and I really want to look at advice columns, Ryan emailed me about an hour later and said that he had just written a script and scraped all the Reddit data and we should have it tomorrow and we can start looking at it. And so for the past year, we've been looking at the advice subreddit on Reddit, just general advice, and we've been asking all sorts of questions, some of which we may talk about today. And it really all comes back to this idea of good advice. And what is good advice? Is it a thing? Is it a construct? Academically speaking, can we operationalize it as something? To me, as a social psychologist, something is interesting when there's a lack of consensus and a lot of lay perceptions on what something is or is not. And so if I were to ask you all to think about good advice, most likely you would all come up with different answers for me as to what good advice is. Some of the linguists may be a little bit more precise and talk about something being true, like a true positive. If I tell you to do something and it ends up being a good decision or having a good outcome, if I tell you it's gonna rain, you should use an umbrella, and it does rain, that's good advice. But what about complicated situations for which there isn't really a right answer, where other opinions could be valid? What's good there? A lot of what I heard is something that's unexpected, a perspective I hadn't considered, something that's funny. And my favorite, I think we tend to say that's really good advice when you want to sort of leave a conversation. So yeah, that's really good advice. I'll think about that. You walk away and you're like, that was a terrible idea. So yeah, there's high demand for good advice. I think we all want it. We go looking for it in different places, whether we're searching it on Google, posting on Facebook, looking on LinkedIn, asking expert networks. We do this as humans, as individuals, also as enterprises. So it's interesting and it's ripe. And what we want to talk about today is that it's worth looking at and trying to break it down into its component parts.
So we're going to do a little bit of a good cop, bad cop thing. She says the interesting, fun stuff. I say the stuff that may make everyone really angry.
Yeah.
So,
I was
hold
so
your
worried
pitchforks
you were
and
going to
torches
say
till
I was
the
a
end,
bad
please. I want to do a little bit of expectation management because we come from a very different background, I think, than a lot of the people in the room. We are social scientists by trade and by training. We use a lot of data science techniques and have a lot of the same kind of machine learning toolkits and everything that a lot of people in this room use, but we tend to use them very differently from a lot of you use them. Often we look at things like maximizing accuracy, area under curve and things like that. For us, we're a lot more concerned about understanding the data, understanding processes and psychology. These are all things that, as it turns out, are really, really tricky to nail down. There are a lot of social processes and psychological processes. They're just so highly multi-determined. It doesn't really make sense to create a really big, elaborate ensemble model or something like that to maximize accuracy if we can't figure out what's actually happening, what are the processes that are active here. So we do a lot of this stuff, with the stuff we're going to talk about today. We've done ensemble learners and some neural nets and things like that, but we're not going to really talk about that today. We want to give you some of the kind of more basic, accessible information so you can walk out of here today and actually have information that's actionable the moment your foot hits the door, essentially. So that's kind of that expectation management. I also want to touch base briefly, just in case people don't know what this is. How many people are familiar with LIWC, Luke? Okay, not that many. Enough. This is something that we use, and if you even do like a Google Scholar search or just a Google search, you'll turn up, at this point, thousands of papers that use it. This is something that we use, and a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about extensively uses Luke, although we use a lot of other techniques as well. This is a tool and basically a lexicon that categorizes language according to different psychological processes and social processes and things like that. At this point, there's a lot of research that shows that these clusters of words, not just kind of a big open vocabulary approach, which we can do too, but these specific psychological clusters of words tell us very specific things about what's happening in a person's head. And this is true in emails, natural language. Basically, anytime people are making language, you can infer to some degree what's going on under the hood, or the psychological processes at play based on the words that they use. So that's what Luke is, and if you have questions about that, obviously you can touch base with us. I'll make a click sound. So just a quick overview of the data that we used. As Kate mentioned, we pulled data from Reddit. I assume most people here know what Reddit is. For the one person who might not, basically it's a massive collection of discussion boards. And each board is dedicated to a single topic, and there's a board for just about anything you can imagine, and then about 500 more things that you wish you'd never heard of and can't unsee once you've seen it. And one of these specific boards or subreddits is specifically for advice. It's a location for people to show up and ask for advice on virtually any topic. And then other people who also subscribe or just visit the board can show up and give advice to those people who are asking for it, and they can respond to each other, and there's a nice hierarchical structure to it. And there's also metadata there. There's mechanisms by which people can essentially vote for a vote, downvote, essentially indicate the degree to which they agree with advice that's given, or how much they like the person that showed up and gave advice and the way they framed it and things like that. There's a lot of unique individuals here. There's about 30,000 advice solicitations. Most of those are just one-offs by people. People show up, they ask for advice, they get advice or they don't, and then they go away and they don't come back. There's a lot of people, probably 75% of the individuals in this data set are the people who are giving advice. There's not a lot of overlap there, and for the most part, the people who are giving advice give advice repeatedly. They're there all the time. They're there for long stretches of time. There are people who give advice, every other day for years on end sometimes. So there's a lot of really rich and interesting questions you can ask with a data set like this. Now, to our benefit, all of this data comes in the form of natural language, and then some of the metadata, like when people post and the voting system and how that played out, votes, downvotes for each post and things like that. And so we went through and we took a couple of broad techniques of quantifying the language in all the advice solicitations and all of the advice that people are giving. And the first main approach is using the tool I just referred to. And then we've used other tools like mean extraction helper, essentially kind of broad topic modeling approaches. We've tinkered with some other stuff. Most of this is not worried about kind of those hardcore nuts and bolts of the computational linguists care about, like word sense disambiguation, things like that. Generally, we don't need it, and we do those things, but again, not ready to focus here. And so we have 3 big research questions. I'll let you tackle those.
So, right, when we started looking at the Reddit data set, some of the most high-level constructs that I was interested in looking at is which situations elicit advice. So from the asking perspective, do people have a propensity to give advice towards certain situations over others? And this was interesting to me as a product owner, so being in my advice app in the early phases of beta testing where I was giving a lot of advice, and I found myself sort of asking, like, from what perspective am I giving advice? What is good advice? What is honest advice? How can I give better advice? But also, I found that certain situations were easier to advise on than others. And I was just trying to figure out, like, what is it about those situations? Sometimes they were things that I wasn't really a domain expert in. You know, it was about relationship issues, but I suddenly found myself having a lot to say about that, or parenting issues, etc. So we were just kind of interested, is there some science to it? Are there certain situations that elicit more advice than others? Also, we looked at this both stylistically and topically using the two methods that Ryan just talked about, so we can start to understand, is there a linguistic style that predicts what gets more advice or is correlated with it? And also topically, do accident situations or situations about relationships tend to get a lot more perspective? Secondly, the big question, what is good advice? And what's awesome about Reddit, and I will just kind of caveat that Reddit is absolutely a starting place. So this is not like our take on advice in general, but really what's great about Reddit is that we have this amazing output variable of upvotes, so we can operationalize good advice as what gets upvoted. So what does get upvoted? And then lastly, what is the structure of advice? Because this is an initial foray into the world of advice, how can we break it down into vectors or into its component parts and really understand what are the different ways of giving advice? Okay, so just a little bit of a spotlight on the data. To me, this sends a message that advice is important and worth looking at. And that's to say that when people ask advice, as Ryan already explained, and I think we have the intuition on Reddit, is that people talk about everything. So when we use meaning extraction, we see these topics emerging. These are just the top 10 categories. People are asking about life, love, family, college, university, feelings, all sorts of emotional states, dating, which surprisingly is not even higher, work, finance, living arrangements, high school. I mean, really everything. I'd be hard-pressed to think of something that doesn't show up. And that's really just kind of setting the stage. That's what Reddit's about. You guys know it. People talk about everything with all sorts of detail.
So the first big question is, what gets advice? What are the things that people show up asking for advice on that other people kind of seem to gravitate towards or flock to? Or even another way to say that is, what are the types of topics for which people generally have a lot of advice and are willing to share it? Topically speaking, the three strongest predictors, and again, we're giving you a very kind of topical overview here, are things about family. When people are having problems with their family, parents, brothers, sisters, things like that, people tend to kind of come out of the woodwork and have a lot of advice to give. Same with housing issues. When people are asking questions about, apartments and rental contracts and all these other things, people generally appear to have a lot of experience there and have a lot of thoughts to offer. And same for accidents. Accidents, mostly legal accidents, not like they woke up and their bed was soaked. I didn't see those. I'm sure some of those are in there.
I think I saw some.
Okay, you're looking at a different part of Reddit than I am.
That's true.
And these are things where, generally speaking, except for family, there tend to be a lot more responses. People see these things and come out and have advice to give. And we'll get much more into like the types of advice and things like that in a minute. Now,
Well, one thing is, though, I do think it is worth emphasizing that we don't know why those situations get more advice. From that kind of product owner's perspective, in my experience of just finding it easy to give advice, I suddenly had a lot more to say about it, but that wasn't to say that I knew I had a lot of advice to give. And so I think that's a really interesting empirical question there, is it easy to give advice? Is it just attention getting because it's an accident, people want to weigh in and be a part of that conversation? Or is there just a plethora of advice on that topic and maybe more of a right answer? But I don't know, it's like a very interesting empirical question.
I agree.
Thanks.
We're in agreement. Stylistically speaking, so this isn't necessarily what are people talking about when they're asking for advice, but how they're talking about, how are they asking for advice. And there are, again, many things beyond this, but kind of the top predictors of kind of calling people out to give advice, stylistically speaking, are when people solicit advice specifically to summarize this, kind of a very personal way, using lots of pronouns, so words like, he, she, him, her, it, things like that. They're using a lot of language that's high in negative affect. So words that you see when people are really kind of distressed or having problems. This includes things like words about being angry, words about being anxious. And the language also tends to be very simple. They use smaller words, so 6 letters are words larger than 6 letters long. Articles are also a very strong indicator of how formally someone is speaking. It also tells us some other things, but that's kind of a take-home point here. So when people show up and they're really kind of distressed and saying, please help me, and they're saying it in a very personalized way, people seem to be much more willing to provide advice in those situations.
There are a couple of other things I think really interesting about that. Like one of the things that I was seeing in the product is that really surprisingly, some of the younger demographics that I had coming in asking situations where it was clearly like a high school situation were drawing a lot of advice, and I found those situations like intellectually speaking quite boring, and I was surprised that they were getting so much advice. And then when I saw this analysis, it made all sorts of sense because they were like candy. They were so easy to just, obviously go talk to the guy if you like him, duh, and so I thought that was interesting. And then Ryan and I are having a little bit more of a philosophical debate about this one here, but when I see articles involved in a conversation, to me it's a sign of concrete thinking. You're really talking about, this, and it's categorical, and to me, the lack of articles is a sign of abstract thinking. And so that is somebody who's having a situation that they need to work through. And I think, and this is a huge leap, that it may evolutionarily be somebody who's kind of needing help processing something, and the advice givers are jumping in to help them through that situation. So I know I went from like articles to the meaning of life, but I do think that there's something there because again, it's a massive data set, and it's interesting that articles come up so highly in a negative fashion.
Yeah,
but we're still talking about it.
During the break, we're going to have an arm wrestling competition to see who's right.
I'm actually quite strong. Okay, so this is where it gets really exciting as far as I'm concerned. One thing I did forget to say on the last slide, just in terms of what gets advice, Ryan had mentioned that 75% of the people in the Reddit database are advice givers. One of the things that I'm also finding in life is that people resonate more as advice givers than advice askers. A lot of the psychological research validates that idea that we don't all like to ask for advice. It was surprising to me, but what we're seeing in the product is that people give 4 times as much advice as they get. So when you come in and have the opportunity to play either role, you tend to do it about 4 times more in terms of giving advice. Okay, so what is good advice? So again, back to these lay theories about what is good advice. I think when somebody approaches you and you want to give them good advice, you tend to want to speak from personal experience. Here's what I did in that exact situation. I'm so glad you came to me because I have a lot to say about that situation. It turns out that's quite wrong. So what we're seeing is that things that get upvoted, good advice is really confident sounding. It has a lot of status in the language, just in terms of the way that you're using pronouns. You're saying a lot of you words, not I words. So you're telling people what to do as opposed to talking about your personal experience. And this may seem intuitive when you hear it, and I think that's why it's a big idea, is that in fact, I words are negatively correlated. People downvote personal situations. They come to Reddit with the intention of being told what to do. So again, I think it just validates this idea that advice is interesting and it's a different dynamic than we see conversationally in other places. Because typically we do want to have that repartee, like I did this, I did, you see like a lot of language style matching in terms of I pronouns. So yeah, it sounds confident, it conveys status, it's relational, it talks about who's involved. It's almost like you're paying attention to all the different people involved in the situation and getting the lay of the land and being really relational in your thinking. Though there are a lot of words there, so that's kind of interesting. It's like if you put not necessarily detail or big words or intelligent words, but you just have a lot to say, that gets upvoted. And then low I pronouns. And then just to kind of give you a sense of the data, the average piece of advice gets upvoted 1.8 times. But we do see a crazy range here and some weird anomalies in the data about the types of things that get upvoted. It is, again, a very unique community, and we should not think about all advice as acting like Reddit data.
the last main question we're starting to look at here is basically getting at the style advice, and can we kind of determine the different ways in which people give advice based on the language that they use. And there are a lot of different ways you can approach this. These are the results of essentially a data reduction technique, where we take all of this information and we give it to a couple of algorithms, and we let it kind of see what styles of advice, let me rephrase that, what types of language naturally clump together, and see, do those tell us anything about the different styles and the different ways in which people give advice. And the top 5 that we're finding relatively consistently, no matter how we crunch the data, and there are others, are essentially what we see here. More than anything else, especially in this data set, a very imperative style of giving advice is far and away the most common. So people show up, they say, hey, I need help, I'm having this problem. You know, there's basically a 3 out of 4 chance that the type of advice they're going to get, and this is true regardless of what their situation is, generally speaking, is people are going to say, here's what you should do. You need to go do this, talk to this person, go talk to a lawyer. These types of very imperative, directive ways of telling the person what to do. There's also kind of more of a thoughtful, head in the clouds style of advice, where, you know, somebody asks you about the problem, you're like, well, you know, let's think about it a little bit more, let's, you know, play in a drum circle and have a good time. It's not that extreme, but it's kind of a more thoughtful, probing approach to getting at what is the core problem that the person is asking about, and thinking deeply and kind of encouraging the person to think about what the problem is and what the solutions may be. Every once in a while, and these create some great outliers, something that we're just calling harsh advice, which is just basically really nasty language. Like, that's stupid, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, suck it up and get out there. And it's just
a little nastier.
Oh yeah, it's
Come
just
on.
it's like a rich chocolate of expletives. It's beautiful. There's also a very relational style of advice, which is, it's correlated with the imperative type of advice, where it's about people, and you'll see them saying, like, go talk to this person, you know, ask a friend to do this, but this is much more heavily focused on just the social aspects. This includes things like encouraging the person to go seek support and so on. And then lastly, there's kind of an optimistic, it's kind of an empty calories of advice, where it's like, hey, good job, great, good for you. And it's a very positive spin, and it can even be things like, oh, you know, keep your chin up, things are going to be fine. And I think what's interesting about this is that, especially kind of the very optimistic, you know, this is a good example, like, good luck, that's awesome. People aren't always asking for advice on things that are troubling them in their lives. People may get a really good job somewhere, and they're just asking for advice like, oh, you know, how do I, you know, break in with a new company and, you know, make sure that I fit in. That's not necessarily a very troubling, problematic situation, right? It's a good situation, and somebody just kind of wants extra information, and people respond to that often in a very positive way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the percentages that we have indicated here is the proportion of advice related to each of those factors. So it's interesting that imperative is the highest one. That's the most common type of advice that we see. But interestingly enough, relational advice is the factor here that's most highly correlated with upvotes or good advice. So people really like that, sort of like pointing out all the players that are involved and combining that with the imperative. So like, tell me how to relate to my world. Is there anything else here? Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most interesting things, I think, from a product perspective, and some of the other developers or product owners in the audience can relate to this. Like, when you think about giving feedback to people based on their interactions in a product, and you want to tell them about the style of advice that's right for them, or, you know, in terms of the fashion site. I can't see the presenter in the audience anywhere. He left. Well, this would have been super relevant for him, so he lost. But in terms of, you know, understanding if you're going to guide a user to an experience that's good for them, you know, can we figure out, do people resonate with different styles of advice, or do people have their own style of advice or want a certain style and come in looking for that and then come out all the better for getting it? Okay, so yeah, in conclusion, I think advice is worth taking a look at. I also think it's worth all of you taking the time to go to the iTunes store, search for Sooth Honest Advice, and give it a shot yourself. it's worth taking a closer look at, and it's also worth doing so in a variety of ways. And I think each of you guys, Jason as an example, has played with this data a little bit. It's worth thinking about from a topic modeling perspective, from linguistic style perspective, just all sorts of, or even AI, just to understand what really is going on here. We don't have a lot of information about what this body of conversation is, and it's worth looking at. We saw that it spans every topic imaginable, just to kind of sum up some of the findings that we presented, and it has a unique stylistic structure. Interestingly, personal, simple, troubling situations elicit the most advice. So if you're thinking about personal implications when you want advice, maybe think about being vulnerable and approaching it from a really personal place and playing up how troubling it is for you. But be simple, don't overcomplicate it, don't use big words. Counterintuitively, the best advice is not personal experience. When people come to you and ask for advice, really try to take a more objective stance, or just tell them what to do. And don't worry about it, just tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. And then lastly, these unique and coherent styles of giving advice not only exist, but are reliable, and I think they make a lot of sense. If you go back and think about the different styles of giving advice, I resonate with a lot of them, and I think it's interesting that those kind of unique styles emerge, and that people may have personal preferences for one style over another. Also, on the lines of parting wisdom, not only should you go and try out the app, but you can go to my Facebook page, facebook.com/SoothSpace, check out some of our content. And there was a third thing. You can come to my panel on Sunday, where we're talking about good advice from another perspective, more about how to give it, not necessarily some of the data and the language involved there, with a cognitive scientist, Art Markman, who comes at it from a different perspective. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, very nice talk, thanks. So I have a comment and a sort of follow-up question. The comment is, you may already know this, but there was a big dump of Stack Overflow content, I want to say about a year or so ago. We downloaded it, started poking around it, I haven't looked at it in a while, but that might be really germane to what you
Actually, that's really interesting, because it could be like a great comparison data set for something with more objective outcomes, where people are really like closing the loop on that worked, thanks, as opposed to that was good advice. I liked how it made me feel.
That was my question. Like, do you think what some of the things you're discovering in that Reddit data would translate to more technical domains? I mean, I think the data set, I don't know if it's in there or not, but presumably the thumbs ups and downs that exist in the stack.
Honestly, I'm hoping not, because I would like to think that the product that I'm creating offers a unique experience to some of the places where we can search for more objective information. And my hypothesis is that there is no forum for these intimate, complicated situations for which there is no right answer. So what do we do when we're in between a rock and a hard place, or like, I guess the opposite would be like paradise and nirvana? How do we make those decisions and weigh the different opinions that people have, and then figure out like, what are the appropriate outcome variables? If not an upvote or a thumbs up or thumbs down, is it like the clarity that I get, how it makes me feel, whether it ended up feeling like a good decision, objectively being one? I don't know. But so I would simply like that data to compare, and I would love to see different things.
And I would say probably about 50-50, right? You can imagine, so something like Stack Overflow, there's going to be a lot of imperative, like we need to install this package and do this or that. But people asking for advice on Stack Overflow probably don't need to like make themselves vulnerable. It's like if you're trying to build a shed, you don't need to be like, I'm having such a hard time, which wood composite do I use? Like, help please. So I see like there's room for kind of variance based on domain and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's worth probably poking around, because it includes not just Stack Overflow, the like hacker technical, but there's a lot of like domain areas like graduate school, academic stuff, social. I mean, it leans more technical than probably what your guys' bread and butter, but there is more of the human, side in there than just Stack Overflow. I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'll dig it up and try to send you guys a link to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, or feel free to hack at it.
I think actually I already have that data set.
Oh, do you?
I think so.
You see, Ryan hoards data sets the way that other people have like shoes or clothes or something. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, I understand what you're saying about Stack Overflow is probably different, but what about other subreddits on Reddit? Do you think they would be similar? How do you think they would be different?
We know a little bit. I mean, it's an empirical question, and we looked at legal and health in the very beginning.
So originally there was just the advice subreddit, and then it kind of splintered. There's like dating advice, legal advice, medical advice, and like 5 or 6 other kind of main ones. Pardon? Yeah, advice animals, very, very relevant. And that for a lot of the stuff, especially kind of the highlights that we talked about here, a lot of those seem to be pretty general. They span, especially things like basically clout, so kind of authoritative language, use of first-person singular pronouns, and even, obviously not topic, but especially the stylistically things, tend to be fairly consistent. Not always the same strength of the relationship, but the relationship itself is fairly consistent across all these kind of different general domains of advice. Do we have time for more?
Sure.
Do you have any way of knowing what piece of advice the asker took and if it correlates with the most uploaded one?
I do in my product. We don't know.
Not with the Reddit
with
data.
Reddit, we see rare instances where people come back and say, thanks, that was good advice. I mean, you see more of that in Stack Overflow, and other forums online have that data available. But I used to work at a social media monitoring research firm, and one of the problems was that that's a really rare dynamic to see online, that people are reluctant to take the extra time to go back and close the loop, much to a brand's dismay.
Has there been very much experimental data, like in academia, on this subject? For example, looking at the different types of advice, they're pretty varied, and presumably people are getting different types of reinforcement from that for different reasons. Maybe altruistic, other people's more for elevating their sense of dominance. It just seems like that would be interesting and provide some insight of your and control for whether it's externally valid relative to Reddit.
Yeah. I mean, I'm obsessed with advice. I think it's like the most ripe topic worth studying, and I've talked to a lot of academics about their approach toward it, because people have really different takes, whether you talk to somebody in linguistics versus social or cognitive or clinical psychology, and even a lot of people in the communications department are coming at it different ways. One of the reasons why it hasn't been studied so much is because of the student sample population. So, again, like Ryan's bringing the Pennebaker Lab into big data, and with his hoarded data sets gives us a lot of kind of access to naturalistic situations in which advice exists. But from an experimental perspective, it's really difficult to study advice and what ended up happening, to your perspective, or to your question, in the college population, and the types of experiences that they have are not very diverse. So there's that. There's also a lot of ethical concerns about, how can you study advice? So there are reasons why it has not been studied, but there are reasons, as far as I'm concerned, as to why it should be studied.
And I've seen it studied, but in a very kind of, the way I usually describe it is a very binary fashion, where the advice itself is not so much is not so much itself the object of study. It's more just a thing with a binary outcome. So, in a boardroom, if you give advice, what are the factors that lead to either following or not following advice, or medical settings and things like that, but not kind of advice as a thing, as a living, breathing, fancy thing.
Yeah. The other thing is that advice is really hard to ask, and there's a lot of research on what it takes to ask for advice, just how difficult it is to say, I don't know, I don't have all the answers, all the barriers to getting vulnerable and speaking in that personal style and asking other people for opinions. So there are a lot of reasons why it's so hard that when you do study it, you're almost creating an artificial scenario of I see it in user testing all the time. Like, think of a situation on which you need advice, and all of a sudden people just freeze. And it's like, I don't really have any questions. I don't need advice. I know everything. So it's hard. It's really hard to ask for advice, but you should all do it. Steve,
really
do you want?
quick.
Okay.
In my analysis of forums like Reddit and Quora, one thing which keeps on happening is that if a certain answer is upvoted more than a certain number of times, everyone seems to then anchor on that answer and just keep upvoting that answer. And thus what happens is that one particular answer gets all the limelight. Another thing which happens is that certain good answers might get buried under the numerous answers which keep happening on that forum. So does that not offset your correct answer by measuring by upvotes or not? Because certain good answers would not be upvoted because of that, right?
So there's a couple of things. First of all, the kind of joy and the bane of this is there is no such thing as a good answer for this, right? It's all highly subjective. To speak more directly kind of the data questions, what's nice, especially about this board, is that there's variance, but there's not, you don't get these huge tails. There's like, you know, one piece of advice has like 2,000 upvotes. Like if you go to any kind of like front page thread of Reddit, there's gonna be, you know, 5,000 responses and like 5 of them have massive upvotes and then it just tails off super quickly. That's not really the case with the distribution data on this board specifically. It's not perfectly Gaussian, but it's like, it's nice in that territory where you get, you know, 5 replies and like a kind of very modest upvoting and downvoting. It's not that extreme.
Yeah, but psychologically speaking, of course, there's a bandwagon effect, you know, and you see that in the internet in general. So it's easy to exclude from a data perspective, you know, just look at the cases that fall closer to the mean and then see if we have a similar structure. But it's early days. Thank you guys.